This week on the podcast, we talk the Woolworths warehouse strike with Socialist councillor Sue Bolton.
Everyone here is calling for dignity, respect, and that's not a lot to ask for from these corporate giants who are making billions off the backs of these hard workers out here and around Australia. It's time that they pay up, it's time that they dig deep, but also to put people over KPIs, people over profits, and people deserve that dignity and that respect, and we're going to keep fighting until we get that.
One day longer,
one day stronger.
One day longer,
one day stronger.
When I say union, you say power. Union,
power.
Union,
power.
Union,
power.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Green Left News podcast. My name is Isaac Nellist and I'm talking to you from Gadigal Wongal country in Sydney. And today on the podcast, we will be talking to Socialist councillor Sue Bolton. Sue's a councillor in the Merri-bek Council in Melbourne. We're going to be talking about the strike of Woolworths warehouse workers that's been going on for the past couple of weeks in New South Wales and Victoria. But before we get to that, I'd just like to mention that we are recording this podcast on stolen land that was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And Green Left pledges to stand with First Nations people in campaigns for justice, land rights and sovereignty. Also, before we get started, if you'd like to help this podcast continue, you can become a supporter at greenleft.org.au/support. Makes a massive difference to help us continue. We don't get any corporate funding or advertising. It's only $5 a month to sign up. It's the best way to receive our content and to support the work that we do. Also, we've launched a bit of a fundraising drive because we've got to update the Green Left website and it's going to cost us $81,000. That's already with a good discount. So we're asking people if you have a bit of spare money lying around and make a bit of a holiday donation to Green Left at greenleft.org.au/donate. There'll be more details in the podcast description. Now, on with the interview. So if you've been grocery shopping in the last few weeks, you might have noticed that the shelves at Woolworths are looking particularly bare. And that's because the warehouse workers that provide a lot of that stock have been on strike from November 21st to December 7th. So more than 1,500 workers across at least 4 sites in Victoria and New South Wales took industrial action to fight for a better deal from the supermarket giant. And it was announced on December 7 that Woolworths had put an improved but still flawed deal that workers have voted to accept after a Fair Work Commission ruled that picket lines outside the warehouses were unlawful. So to discuss, the impact of this strike, the reactions from the bosses, and also, just what the workers were fighting for, we're joined by Sue Bolton, who is a Socialist Alliance councillor on Merri-bek Council in Melbourne, and was on the picket line supporting the workers. So welcome to the podcast, Sue.
Hi, Isaac. How's it going?
Yeah, good. So I guess to start off, the Woolies warehouse workers were on strike for more than 2 weeks, it's about 2.5 weeks. And while, better pay was part of the demands, the main kind of demand was around safety and this new system called the framework, which tracks kind of how workers pack the products and how fast they're able to do that. So could you talk about, what is this framework and what impact would it have on workers in the warehouses?
Well, this framework goes to a point that workers, trade unionists have been fighting around for 100 years, which is the right to control the work process, the right to control the speed of the process. So many decades ago, there would have been strikes and industrial action about the right to control the speed of the assembly line. And, no doubt there are fights along these lines in call centres and various other places. And so this was, it's a system which is developed over several decades in warehouses. There is a lot of monitoring of workers and their speed, and this has been going on for a long time. But Woolworths is trying to take it to a new level with what they described as a coaching and productivity framework, where an algorithm determines how long it will take for workers to pick a row. And people have workers in the warehouses already have, even before this framework agreement, headphones which beam messages into their ears at the beginning of a row to say it should only take you X number of minutes to pick this row, or and then at the end of the row it says you pick this row at only 90% capacity or 70% capacity or whatever. Now the algorithm doesn't take into consideration the fact that there might be congestion in a row with lots of pickers in a row at a particular point in time, which means you can't get to the items. It doesn't account for the fact that there might be missing items. It doesn't account for the fact that some days you're going to be a bit more sluggish than other days, like just recovering from the flu or a cold or having a bad headache, or the fact that a 55-year-old worker might not be able to pack or pick at the same rate as a fit and healthy 22-year-old. And also the fact that workers have different heights, which has an impact on ability to access items and stretch to reach items. So this is, and so, no one's going to be able to meet this algorithm. And this is really trying to take workers into the Amazon warehouse style arrangement, which is probably the worst of the worst of control, surveillance of workers and control. So under this, now there's always been a certain amount of pressure on workers to meet certain pick rates, but the dangerous thing, extra dangerous thing with this framework that was being put forward by Woolies is that workers would be able to be disciplined and lose their jobs over this. In the past, it's been a way of pushing workers, but under this arrangement, they would have been able to be dismissed. So this is the most significant of the gains that the workers have won. And I think the fact that this was the biggest issue for the workers, and it was so publicised during this dispute, will make other workers think about what they're putting up with on their jobs. And so what they won with regard to the framework is there will still be an algorithm which, beams messages into their headphones to say, it should only take you X number of minutes to pick this row and how many minutes it took you at the end of the row. But you won't be able to be disciplined if you don't reach 100% of the algorithm's predetermined rate 100% of the time. And that's the really significant victory that the workers have won.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of this like treating workers like machines, like not considering them to be real people. And yeah, the Amazonification is a good word for it. As part of this strike, there was a community picket that was formed outside one of the sites in Dandenong South in Victoria. And it was actually shut down, as I mentioned earlier, by a Fair Work Commission ruling. But you spent some time on the picket line before it was shut down. Could you tell us a bit about like what it was like on the picket line and what impact it had on the campaign?
Well, the Dandenong South picket line ended up being very important, and I didn't initially realise why until I visited the picket line. So the Dandenong South warehouse has only been in operation for 5 or 6 years, and it was set up when Woolies closed down a warehouse in Hume, in Broadmeadows area. And that Hume warehouse had won the best wages and conditions of any Woolies warehouse in Victoria. So they replaced that warehouse with a roboticised warehouse, which is the Dandenong South warehouse. And apparently Woolies started off this warehouse with only 70 workers. They thought they'd be able to get away with virtually no workers in this warehouse because there's a robotic section. I mean, it's very heavily computerized, roboticized. It's a huge warehouse. and apparently it processes 40% of all of Woolies warehouse work in the country. So that was why it was so significant. It produces a lot more than all of the other warehouses. After they started in 5 or 6 years ago, they started with 70 workers. Then they started to discover they had to employ more and more workers, and now it's almost 400 workers who work there, because the robots can only pick up things in square boxes. They can't pick up round or bulky or something that's not in a box or an odd shape kind of item. So they've discovered they need more workers, surprise, surprise. But the other thing with the Dandenong warehouse, Dandenong South warehouse, is that this was, because it was a new warehouse, it was set up with a Greenfields agreement, which was like the Woolies worked out, negotiating with themselves, the wages and conditions of those workers before any workers were on site. And then they basically, I think this might have been Howard government legislation, they went to the UWU, the United Workers Union, on a take it or leave it basis. Sign up to this deal, otherwise we'll go to another union, which would have been the STA, notoriously bosses union, the shop distributive and allies union. So the UW was forced to sign up to it, but these Greenfields agreements don't take, they're not according to any kind of industry standard. So they're not on a par with any other warehouse. And what happens at these new Greenfields sites like Dandenong South is that they are put on well below the industry standard. And then every EBA over the next so many years, the workers have to fight to improve their working conditions and improve wages. And it's a really unfair system. So, I mean, I was on that picket line. I was also spent some time on the Lineage picket line. Lineage picket line was really strong, really great delegates, very strong. And a lot of people had never been on strike before, but there were some experienced people on that picket line. The Dandenong South picket line had never had a strike because it was such a new site. They almost went on strike at the last EBA period, but Woolies sort of put forward what workers thought was an acceptable offer in the 11th hour, so they didn't go on strike. But there were certainly some workers who joined the union during the strike or just on the eve of the strike. I was talking to one worker who did that, who was a manager in the stores before, and he joined, had sort of been turned into from someone who had never really been involved in unionism, realised unions were necessary but was not really pro-union. And the conditions in the warehouse turned him into a unionist, basically. So didn't want to cross the picket line, so joined the union. So there was a good, I think, strong morale on the picket line. But being this a smaller number of workers and the most important site for Woolies to get going again, there was a lot of pressure on that picket line. So that's where Woolies tried to break the picket line with scabs. And the workers managed to, stop the scabs getting through with the support of community mobilisation. And I think that was really, really important. So it was a really good, important dispute and a great feeling on the picket line. And there was starting to be more and more people coming down to the picket line as the dispute went on. The dispute went for 17 days, so 17 days without any income for the workers heading into Christmas would have been a big pressure. And some of the sites, more the Lineage site, had a big number of casual workers, but some of the casual workers refused to cross the line, which was also really pleasing to see. So, yeah, it was really great. And I think this was very inspiring. The workers were very gutsy. And I think it's a real shining example to workers all over Australia about what workers need to be prepared to do in order to win our rights.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I saw some great stories on social media and things like that of, food being delivered to the picket line, fruit, lots of community support, and yeah, as well, also seeing the, photos and videos of the buses with the scab labor trying to get in and things like that. So it was interesting to follow from a distance. I just wanted so I heard basically the picket got um, deemed unlawful by the Fair Work Commission. Do you know much about that decision or what went into that?
Well, I understand that Woolworths used a new argument, a different argument to what bosses normally use. I must admit, I was pretty pessimistic about what the likely outcome of the Fair Work Commission was going to be, because generally the Fair Work Commission is should be renamed the Unfair Work Commission, stacked with bosses, advocates, and bosses representatives, Liberal Party people. I mean, there might be a few who are ex-trade union officials, some of whom have forgotten their background. And generally it makes decisions in the interests of the bosses. And frequently it makes decisions to injunct the union off the picket line, injunct delegates off the picket line, sometimes even try and injunct individual workers off the picket line under the threat of huge fines. So I wasn't very optimistic going into it, but they used a new argument, and the new argument was that while the strike was protected industrial action because it was during enterprise bargaining and it had been voted on by the members, the Woolies advocates said that it was the picket line itself stopping workers who wanted to work, i.e. that is scabs, going into or coming out of the workplace was amounted to a breach of good faith bargaining in inverted commas, and therefore it was like having a metaphorical gun to their head. Now, of course, if you didn't have a picket line, of course, you would be in the position that a lot of strikes have been in recent years where, workers have gone on strike but have been, the union's been junked off the picket line and workers have, haven't blocked the scabs. And so workers, just watch workers or scabs coming in and out doing their jobs. So, and the commission made a decision in favour of that argument. It was interesting that they didn't call for all of the picket lines to be ended. They called for the Dandenong South picket line to be lifted. They called for any picketing of the Mulgrave site to be lifted. Now, there's no industrial action at Mulgrave, so that was sort of a bit interesting. And they called for a picket line at in Sydney to be lifted, but I have a feeling it wasn't the warehouse which was taking industrial action. So the two warehouses at in North Laverton, the Melbourne Liquor Distribution Centre and the Lineage cold storage picket line, neither of those had orders to be lifted. So it was sort of interesting, but I think that goes to the heart of the fact that Dandenong South produces most of the warehouse stock within Woolworths chain, and maybe the same as applies to Mulgrave. So it was a bit of a weird decision. And then there was sort of an impromptu community picket the morning after the decision was handed down, which I think probably helped push Woolworths to put forward a new offer. I mean, the commission tried to rule that that was the UW for ignoring the commission and breaching the orders, but it didn't involve any UW members. It was just simply community members who mobilised at short notice. And then Woolworths shortly afterwards produced an offer, which then was agreed to by the workers at mass meetings on Saturday. And I think the Lineage cold storage picket line was ended on the Sunday. So that's when they had their mass meeting. So yeah, so it was it was a bit of a weird decision, but I must admit, having seen Fair Work Commission in operation over many years, I'm not at all surprised.
Yeah, there's just so many restrictions and anti-union legislation that stops, unions from doing everything that they would like to do when they're in this kind of position.
And yet, just following on from that, and yet there's no restrictions on the boss's right to strike. So bosses are able to lock workers out at the drop of a hat, which is like a capital strike, a strike by the bosses. They can lock workers out at the drop of a hat, no repercussions through the Fair Work Commission. Whereas workers to engage in strike action, they have to go through a torturous process. They're only allowed to take protected action during enterprise bargaining, so not during the life of the enterprise bargaining agreement, even if the bosses do something like sack workers, cut workers' hours, or breach the EBA conditions. And then when it is bargaining period, the union has to hold a ballot where they have to include on the ballot every conceivable form of industrial action they may need to take. And then that has to be voted up by all the workers. And so if they forget to put or don't anticipate a particular form of industrial action, that is not protected. So, it might be for a 24-hour strike, an indefinite strike, a 1-hour strike, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's truly ties you up in hoops, and it also obviously gives the boss forewarning of impending strike action so that they can stockpile. But meanwhile, the bosses don't have to go through any of that. They can just simply lock workers out. So their bosses have a right to take industrial action, but not workers.
Yeah, it's a really messed up system when you put it like that. And the bosses locking out the workers would have a devastating effect on workers who rely on the income. So it's crazy. I guess in that context, there's this new agreement's been put, and you already mentioned the big thing about the framework not being able to be used to dismiss workers if they don't meet the 100% pick rate. But what else was kind of included in this new agreement?
Well, they got, I understand they won pay rises in the first year of the agreement of between 4% and 4.5%, so a bit above inflation. And then the pay rises in the subsequent years, which I think is year 2 and year 3, because I think it's a 3-year agreement, were around CPI between 3.15% and 4.5%. Now, the reason it's a range is because of the whole enterprise bargaining system. So all of the workers have started from different pay rates. And so that is why there is a difference between some of the pay increases won by different warehouse sheds. I think one of the reasons why the framework was considered to be so important, and that was such a major feature of the dispute, is because workers were saying, well, we can win a really big pay rise, but if this framework agreement is in place, then we could lose our jobs after 6 months. because they'll deem we're not working at 100% capacity for 100% of the time. So that was where the main focus was. And then I think at different warehouses, there were slightly different focuses. So the MLDC, the Melbourne Liquor Distribution Centre, there was a big focus on redundancy, because I understand that that warehouse is getting towards the end of its life. Apparently, these companies frequently close down warehouses and build new ones. Is that because they're trying to drive down wages and conditions? So MLDC, having being one of the older sheds, they have won pretty good wages and conditions. So they so redundancy provisions were improved. Also in the Lineage cold storage warehouse, they won 50 casuals to be converted to permanent. Now I need to find out the exact nature of that agreement. The Dandenong South warehouse doesn't have as many casuals, I think, because it's a more highly skilled workforce because of operating the robotics, whereas the other warehouses have a much higher percentage of casuals. But that question of casuals being converted to permanent, especially after 6 months, is a really key issue in a lot of industrial disputes, especially in blue collar areas these days. So that hopefully that was a good agreement, as in an automatic conversion after 6 months, but I don't know the details. I just know that the Lineage picket line won 150 extra permanent jobs. Now, there are also sign-on bonuses of up to $1,500 in either cash or gift cards. And then there are other wins in different warehouses regarding weekend penalty rates, payment of shift penalties to maintain ordinary earnings when people are on sick leave. So there are some different, the union hasn't been very specific about which warehouse won what. There is a bit of a feeling, I think, of some people that it would have been good if they'd held out for a bit longer to get more significant pay increases. But it does seem like the workers, they, had put up a really solid fight, including a lot of workers who'd never taken industrial action before. And I think there was a view that they actually had won, they'd won their rights with regard to the productivity framework, and they got an increase in wage above inflation. And so the majority voted to accept at all of the picket lines. I think there were some workers who would have preferred to hold out for a little bit longer to get higher pay rises, but it does seem that the vast bulk of workers actually voted to accept the agreement.
Yeah, I think one thing with this strike is was very visible strike for, ordinary people, because you can go into your nearest like Woolies and see the empty shelves and stuff. So I think that made this, a big story that people could follow along a little bit as it was happening. But what do you think? I mean, I guess particularly in the lead up to Christmas, and if the strike continued in the next few weeks, it would have been this big story about, bare shelves before Christmas. I think I saw number about $50 million in sales Woolworths saying they've lost. Could be more or less than that in reality, but I don't know. But what do you think this strike reveals about, the state of workers' struggle, the power of workers, and what kind of lessons can we learn from it overall?
I think what it shows is workers need to exercise their power. The only power workers have is to collectively withdraw their labour. And if you lose the right to withdraw your labour, that is to go on strike, take industrial action, then it means you're in no better position than a slave. So if you don't have the right to withdraw your labour, then you're no better off than a slave. with the bosses being able to determine everything about you. And I think the other thing the strike revealed is that workers need to fight to have some control over the workplace. And that is an old fight. It's not a new fight, but it hasn't been emphasised so much in recent years. But it's got its own different sort of dynamics in different industries. So the equivalent of the right to control the workflow and everything in, say, in a teaching context would be over the question of having a lower number of students in the classroom so that teachers can pay individual attention to the students. So it's got its own different forms in different sorts of industries, depending on the nature of your work. But this is a very important right for workers to fight for, because it's injuries. Whether or not it is physical injuries or psychological injuries or whatever, it results in injuries for workers. If workers are put under pressure, workers get injured. And once you hurt your back, usually it means you can never fix that. The back isn't replaceable. But the same could be said in jobs where they just force you to go really fast and you put under mental strain. And I do remember, this is a number of years back now, when the union took Telstra, or got Four Corners to do an investigation of Telstra. And in that, they looked at the bullying practices in both sides of Telstra's operations, one in the call centre, and one for the workers who go out and do the maintenance of the lines. And one of the workers who went out to do the maintenance had been trained in the old days at Telstra, where you do preventative maintenance. So you get out to a job, you have to fix a problem, you can see another problem that's about to develop into full-scale problems, so you fix both at the same time. But under these days of time and motion studies and KPIs, you're not allowed to fix both problems. You have to just fix the problem you went out to fix, and leave the other fault until it fully fails, even if that means you go out there the very next day or that afternoon. One of those workers just couldn't bring themselves to, do such shoddy work, that he always did preventative maintenance and got into trouble with his supervisor. He ended up committing suicide. And in the other case, there's a worker in the call centre who was one of the golden workers for Telstra. This particular worker always had fantastic sales rates and all the rest of it, because nowadays they have to sell things when people ring them with problems. And as she met the new targets, they kept increasing her targets till eventually she committed suicide as well. And when I was telling a friend of mine who worked for Telstra about that, he said, yes, the previous year someone had jumped off the roof of the Roma Street Telstra building in Brisbane. So, this is what happens, and whether it is mental injury or physical injury or both, this control by the bosses of trying to force workers to work faster and faster and more unsafely has detrimental effect on workers. So this strike was about taking back control and workers taking back control. And that is really, really important, as well as your pay rates. Both are important for workers. And so I think this strike was a win. There's some who would say it would have been good to have gone a bit further in terms of the wage increases. But I think you have to say this was a win, and a lot of guts from workers to go on strike for 17 days, including young workers, old workers, all sorts of different workers, all sorts of different backgrounds. And I'd say some of the warehouses, not so much the Dandenong South one, but some of the workers, some really magic moments showing the experience that the Maori and Pacifica workers have built up in New Zealand through the trade union movement over there. And so some of those workers, some of those Maori and Pacifica delegates played a fantastic role on the picket line. I mean, look, everyone played a fantastic role, but the Maori and Pacifica workers played a especially important role.
Yeah, definitely. It's very inspiring, and hopefully we'll see more industrial action and strikes like this in the new year and in 2025. I guess for people at home listening to this, to make sure you join your union and get involved. And yeah, as you said, there's some real devastating consequences when workers don't have a say over their workplaces. And, it's all part of, we need to be building up workers' strength so we can make decisions about, the things we do every day in our workplaces, in our lives. Was there any final comments you wanted to add before we wrap up, Sue?
Just that it is really important for people to join their unions. If they're not in a union and there's an issue on the job, or if you're in an unorganised workplace, because nowadays there are many unorganised workplaces where there might just be one or two, especially in hospitality jobs, but there are other similar jobs where it might just be one or two people in the union, or maybe only a handful of workers on the job. And so people feel really like they can't say no to their boss, especially in hospitality. Maybe you might have a seemingly nice boss, but they're underpaying you or really taking advantage of you. And so people often feel, especially a lot of younger workers, like they can't say no, or people who are on temporary visas of various kinds feel that they can't say no to their boss, especially in small workplaces. But you can still organise even in unorganised workplaces. And of course, now we've got social media, so we can also help shame employers. And so it might even start as simply as sign-on letters, petitions in the workplace, and then build up to calling in the union, calling Trades Hall in your particular state to find out which union covers you, and calling a meeting with your union. And it's also possible now, even if it's not possible for you to have a workplace meeting, to have sort of a closed WhatsApp chat or Facebook Messenger or some sort of social media grouping that is private, that the boss can't see, and so that you can work out tactics, organise off-site meetings. It's always possible to do something, so people shouldn't feel that if they're not in a highly unionised job, because there's very few highly unionised jobs now. So the more we organise, the better. And I think that's the message. The more we organise, the more we give confidence to other people to win. And yeah, you can win. And you never know when you go into an industrial campaign, you don't know if you're going to win or not. But what you do know is that if you don't try, you don't win, you'll lose. So you have to fight. The old union saying, dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't fight, you lose. That slogan is as true now as it is, as it ever has been. And the other one, especially if you're on a picket line, you're in dispute with the boss, is one day longer, one day stronger. So you have to stay out one day longer than the boss, because they're trying to constantly demoralize you all the time. So dare to struggle, dare to win. If you don't fight, you lose.
100%. I think that's a great point to end it on there. So thanks for joining us today, Sue.
All right, thanks.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Green Left News podcast. As always, you can become a supporter at greenleft.org.au/support to help us continue producing it. This is actually going to be our last news podcast of the year. We've got a few special interviews and other podcasts lined up, ready to go. So keep your eye on the podcast feed because those will be continued to be uploaded over the summer period. And we'll be back with a proper news podcast in early January. Also, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, Green Left is embarking on an important and urgent website upgrade. So we need to raise $81,000, which is quite a lot of money, but if you make a donation, that can make a massive difference, big or small. It will really help us out. So head to greenleft.org.au/donate to help us out with that. Also, a special thank you to Sean Valenzuela or @LittleArcherBeats for producing the music that you heard on this podcast and the music that's been on the podcast all year round. So special thanks to Sean. And yeah, we'll see you in the new year for some new episodes of the Green Left News podcast. Thanks for listening.